Professor, I had a question.
Yes, Daisy, good morning.
Hi, good morning. So I was just wondering, is there a midterm due this Friday as well as the reflection?
Yes.
Okay, and when are you gonna post the prompt?
You know what? Actually, you're right. I have forgotten that we have both this week. This week, it's just the multiple choice, no reflection paper this week. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the reminder, Daisy. I'll post an announcement about that.
Okay,
And
thank you.
I also needed to change one of my prompts, so I'm going to be posting the prompt as soon as we get down here. The prompt for the final.
Okay, thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay? Well, let's see. Daisy, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's see, I moved my chair this morning, so I realized that the light coming in into this room, it may obscure your ability to see me, which is, you know, all things considered, probably a good thing for you guys. As long as you can hear me, I think that's probably most important. Daisy, can you still hear me? Because I'm trying to adjust something here.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, good morning, everybody. We've got an hour and a quarter. And the way that I'd like to proceed with this, the way that I've done it in the past, I've gotten good feedback about, is to do it in the following way. Make sure you have your testable term sheet available to you. I think that would be really helpful for this exercise this morning. I am going to go through the testable term sheet, go through these terms in essentially the chronological order in which these developments and people and books and ideas emerged in Europe through modernity. Okay. Actually, I'm going to start before modernity because, of course, I'm going to start with Plato. But I'm going to basically start with Plato and then go forward in time. Make sense? So, any questions about, first of all, that approach? Cool. Before I get started, I need to make an announcement. And I'm making this announcement because I don't know how many of you may have actually gotten this announcement from an email. Are you all aware of the recent change to your ability to choose the grading system that you're graded under for this semester only? This was just announced in the last, in the last day. You all know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
So you have until May 9 to choose whether or not you want you want to be graded on the basis of a traditional ABCDF, or if you would prefer to be graded for your classes this semester on the basis of credit, no credit. You all aware of that? So you can make that election for any of your classes, some of your classes, all of your classes. But if you're going to elect a credit, no credit grading basis, you need to do that by May 9. If you don't make any change, then you will continue to be graded on an ABCDF basis. And if you choose to stay in an ABCDF grading system, anybody who receives an F, which frankly doesn't happen in my classes, but anyone who receives an F, that F is automatically going to be turned into a no credit and will not be counted against your GPA. You got that? So it sounds like you all got that announcement, but I just wanted to make sure that that you all are aware of it. So you ready to proceed? So we started this semester looking at the Greek contribution to Western intellectual thought. We grounded ourselves first by understanding the context within which the Greeks were operating and formulating their thinking. This was a profoundly pre-industrial society, right? This was an agrarian society, testable term, where the people lived off the land, right? The economy was agriculturally based. There were some tradespeople. Some people made shoes, right? But the basis of their economy was agriculture, growing crops, herding cattle. The first great Greek philosopher that we looked at, of course, was Socrates, but the one that we spent our most time on, I think appropriately, is, of course, Plato. The most important thing to remember about Plato is, of course, arguably his greatest masterpiece of all, the Republic. And in the Republic, what Plato does, among other things, is he establishes for the first time in the Western tradition this imagination that we do not live in the real world. This is a temporary illusion. We have souls, and when our physical body goes away, our soul returns to where it came from, which is some invisible world where true reality exists. Now, because the current reality, according to Plato, is an illusion, all material things are bogus. And if we get hung up on materialism, we're just playing with toys, because this ain't real. This doesn't matter. Consequentially, then, it's no surprise that Plato was very dubious about property. Plato was so concerned about what our obsession with private property could do to our soul that he insisted in the Republic that the ideal society, the best way for us to live, is to live in a propertyless society. We would understand it now, post Karl Marx, as a communist society, where everybody has essentially the same amount of wealth or poverty, right? And so the reason why everyone exists in basically a property-less state is so that all of us, particularly the rulers, the guardians, could be focused on what really matters, which is, of course, concentrating and meditating and thinking about what the real world, the world of the forms, the invisible reality where we came from and where we are ultimately destined to return to, what that real reality is like. And so the reason why we're even here, according to Plato and to the Platonic tradition, which we see replicated, of course, in a variety of religious traditions, not the least of which is, of course, Christianity, Catholicism, and Protestantism, is the reason why we're here is to live a good life and hopefully make it to the Christians would later refer to it as heaven. And so society is organized with no property in order to better enable the leaders, the guardians, to focus on the true reality and on avoiding the conflict of interest that Plato says inevitably comes when you have wealth and power together. And so Plato argues in the Republic that wealth and power should be separated. If someone has power in a society, they shouldn't have wealth, because if they have both, they will get obsessed with wealth, and they will use their power to not only grow their wealth at our expense, but ultimately they will use their power to wrongly allocate wealth in society such that the masses will be poor and the few who have wealth and power will be able to continue their prestigious, unfair allocation of wealth and power. And so in Plato's Republic, we see themes of inequality, systemic inequality. We see the introduction in the Western tradition of the notion of a soul, everlasting, undying soul, imagination that there's a real world out there somewhere, and that this world is an illusion, and also remember his allegory of the cave. One of the things that we can take from that is Plato's instruction that it is possible for people in power, for government, to exercise a form of mind control, propaganda, and to lie to the masses, to lie to the people, and to convince the people that the reality that they are suffering under is a true reality and it's the best reality. When in truth, Plato argued, very often people in power use these lies. He called it the noble lie. They use these lies in order to perpetuate their power and keep the oppressed exactly what they are, which is oppressed. So in the Republic, we see a whole lot of themes about society, what constitutes a good society, a bad society, a dangerous society, an optimistic society, a faith-based society, a fair society, arguably. We see all of these themes and more, many themes that run throughout the Western tradition when we think about how economics, but more importantly, perhaps how government, how society should be organized. So the most important thing to remember about Plato, aside from his masterpiece, The Republic, is that Plato thought that property was dangerous because there are three parts to our soul, and the third part of our soul is the appetitive part. That's where we have our appetites and our hungers. That is where lies our built in predisposition to become so enamored with material things that we fall in love with them. And to the extent that it degrades our soul and it retards our ability to be righteous with one another. And so that is essentially Plato. It's not a defined term, but his counterpoint is, of course, Aristotle. And I mention Aristotle because the argument here is that Plato and Aristotle, in the different ways that they see government and the different ways that they see the efficacy, the utility, the worth of private property, they largely frame the way that the entire Western tradition thinks about things like reality, government, private property. Because Aristotle, of course, as opposed to his teacher Plato, Aristotle is a materialist, right? Aristotle doesn't believe that Plato is correct when Plato says that this world is an illusion and that there's a real world out there that our soul is destined to return to. Aristotle believes that the only thing that exists is everything that's right here in front of us. If we can see it, touch it, taste it, break it, it's real. If we can't, it ain't. And so in Plato and Aristotle, another of the tensions and dichotomies that we see is the materialist position and the non-materialist or the anti-materialist position of Plato. And so Aristotle's position on private property is private property in and of itself isn't bad. It's what you do with it that counts. Now, Aristotle's position on property would be taken up later by Thomas Aquinas, right? Uh, so the next two important thinkers that we're looking at are Augustine or Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas or Saint Thomas Aquinas. Augustine lives in the 400s and Thomas Aquinas lives in the 1100s and 1200s. Aquinas is more of a Plato guy. I'm sorry, Augustine, the first guy, is way more of a Plato guy. And you can see in his Titanic City of God, where we see a lot of the doctrines and ideas that are core to Christian theology, especially Catholic theology, and to some extent Protestant theology. A lot of the ideas of Christianity that forge people's thinking for centuries later, like original sin. Augustine is the one who crafts the notion of original sin from the book of Genesis, right? And so original sin ends up significantly affecting people's thinking for hundreds of years, because if you're born with original sin, right, uh, then you have to spend your whole life redeeming yourself, right? So it's as if you're born with two strikes against you, and you live in a three strikes and you're put in prison regime. So the rest of your life, you have to be concerned about living the best life that you possibly can, because you were already born with original sin, right? And so this notion that Augustine cements in his great work, City of God, becomes foundational, really, to people's thinking for hundreds of years. Uh, Aquinas comes along after Augustine. Aquinas lives in the 1100s and 1200s. Aquinas is much more of an Aristotelian, because whereas the Greek classics like Plato and Aristotle were lost to Europe for most of the Middle Ages, in the 1100s and the 1200s, there's a rediscovery in Europe by guys like Aquinas of the Greek masters, especially Aristotle. And so Aquinas weaves a lot of Aristotelian ideas into his works. And so Aquinas then adopts almost exactly Aristotle's position on private property. Aquinas says private property in and of itself isn't bad. It's what you do with it that counts. It's exactly what Aristotle said. And so with Aquinas, we begin to see an opening in Catholic theology, more of a tolerance for private property. And this is important because as Aquinas loosens the imaginative constrictions on the efficacy, the value of having private property, over the next couple of centuries, people begin to see the value of having private property and accumulating wealth more and more favorably, right? Because since the pre-Christian times in the Jewish tradition, now we're moving to another testable term, usury. Private property was so looked down upon that it was thought that, in fact, it was Jewish law and later became Christian doctrine, that the lending of money with interest was immoral. And so we see in the Old Testament that usury, defined term, usury, which is the lending of money with interest, was immoral in many places in the New Testament. And Augustine and Aquinas continue that tradition of holding that the lending of money with interest, the practice of usury, is immoral. Why is that important? Because as long as you think lending money with interest and borrowing money with interest is immoral, you are foregoing a very essential catalyst for a market economy. Because as we see, as capitalism takes hold, banks and other financial institutions being able to lend money is absolutely huge to an economy. Side digression, look at the current coronavirus emergency. A couple of weeks ago, Congress passed a $4 trillion bailout package, right? Well, almost half of that money basically went to banks. Why? Because the federal government wants to encourage banks to continue lending. Because in crises, banks do what any other person does. It's human psychology. We hold on to what little cash we might have, right? People stop spending money, banks stop lending money. But if banks stop lending money, then business grinds to a halt, because business relies on banks and bank credit. So usury, being able to lend money with interest, which incentivizes people to lend money because they're going to make some interest off of it, right? To be able to lend money with interest is absolutely huge for jumpstarting capitalism. So that is at least a significant reason why capitalism didn't start earlier. It's because, as a religious matter, in the Jewish tradition and in the Catholic tradition, lending money, at least until the 1520s, lending money with interest was seen as being immoral. Um, Another important contribution of Thomas Aquinas is his notion of dominionism, which is the next testable term. What is dominionism? Dominionism is the belief that all of creation, the entire world, is a gift from God that's been given to all of us to enjoy together. Okay, so dominionism, the way Aquinas said God intended us to understand it. Dominionism does not mean dominate nature. Dominionism means we inherited nature. It's a gift from the Almighty, and so we must take care of creation. We must take care of the world. We must take care of nature. So that, at least in the Thomas Aquinas uh, uh, interpretation of the biblical use of dominionism, right, which he gets from the book of Genesis, God gave man dominion over the earth and all of its creatures. Aquinas says that doesn't mean we dominate them and slaughter and pillage the earth. It means we appreciate these gifts and we take care of them, right? And since all of creation, all material matter is the basis of material wealth creation, then it follows that for Aquinas, extreme inequality is immoral because creation was given to us to enjoy together. So that is essentially Aquinas's notion of dominionism. Later in the semester, when we talk about climate change, we will revisit the notion of dominionism. Now, Aquinas is the third of four virtue ethicists that we look at in this class, arguably the four great virtue ethicists of all time, and they are Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and then lastly, Adam Smith. What is a virtue ethicist? A virtue ethicist is someone who takes the position that deep down inside, we just know. It's innate, it's inborn. We just know what's right and what's wrong. And so the key to living an ethical life is to look inside and to find within our character what is good about us. Where is the goodness within us? And then to draw out that goodness, right? Plato said there were four key virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance or self-control, and ultimately justice. Aristotle had 10, 11, 12 virtues, depending how you count it. Remember, Aquinas had 7 virtues. He had Plato's 4, and then he added 3 more that he said are the revealed virtues from God: charity, hope, and love. Adam Smith, the last of the 4 great virtue ethicists that we look at, says that there are 4 core virtues in us that we need to draw out and cultivate in order to live a moral life. And they're basically Plato's: wisdom, benevolence. He replaces Plato's courage with kindness. Okay? Benevolence means kindness, the way Adam Smith used it. The third virtue, according to Adam Smith, is also temperance or self-control. And then the fourth is, of course, ultimately justice. So that's the virtue ethicist. We are born with virtues, and the key to living a good life is to identify those good virtues inside of our character and draw those out. Massage, exercise, cultivate those good virtues that we are doing. Now, during all of this period in the Jewish tradition and also in the Christian Catholic Middle Ages, uh, a, a, a core uh, practice or element of economics as such during this time was of course how they priced goods and services. The manner in which you price things is core to any type of economic system. For example, if you allow the market to establish prices, then almost by definition, you know you're looking at a market economy, which is a definition, which is a defined term that we're going to talk about presently. Um, but in the Middle Ages and in the Jewish tradition before that, they didn't price things according to the market, according to what people were willing to pay, right, in a free, open, competitive market. These were profoundly religious times when the emphasis was on what's the right thing to do. And so during this time, the right way, the moral way to price things was on the basis of, well, I, I have something I can sell to you. You have a need to buy it. So instead of looking to the market and seeing what other sellers are getting for this product, I'm going to take into consideration how you doing. Are you doing okay? Has your income been affected by the coronavirus? Are your kids okay? Your partner lost her job, whatever. So you guys are hurting. So you know what? I'm gonna discount my usual price on this because I know you're hurting. This is the just price. This is the righteous price. This is the morally correct price, considering your economic and material situation right now. Okay. Um, and so it wasn't market pricing, it was just or justice pricing. Market pricing, another defined term, is, of course, again, whatever the market's willing to bear. And what is the market? The market is simply an aggregation of other people's buy, sell, or hold decisions, right? So if other people are buying a basket of apples for $5, and that's the going rate, well, then you're going to sell your apples presumably for somewhere around there. If you think your apples are nicer, or more to the point, if you think that your customers think that your apples are nicer than other people's apples, then you may not charge $5 a bushel. You may charge $5.25 because your apples are a little bit nicer. If your apples are starting to brown a little bit, then maybe you're going to let them go for $4.50. Indeed, but the basis of your pricing is the market. The basis of the pricing under a just pricing system that was practiced basically until the 1400s, 1500s is, how are you doing? Can you afford to pay more? Or are you hurting right now? Do I need to reduce the price? Because I want to treat you as my customer justly, right? I want to treat you with justice, right? Because we exist in a profoundly moral society, or at least we're trying to be. Now, as we know in our class, modernity begins in 1492 when Columbus makes it back from his voyage across the Atlantic. With the introduction of unprecedented gold and silver in Europe, now Europe begins to become much more interested in materialism and material wealth. If for no other reason than there's simply more of it around. There's way more gold and silver, precious metals around than ever before, and certainly since Aquinas, there has been a greater tolerance and opening to the possibility that making a good living, maybe that ain't bad. So as we know, in the 1520s and 1530s, there's a monumental event which changes the history of Europe forever, and I argue is absolutely indispensable to the rise of capitalism, and that is, of course, what we call the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement begins in Great Britain with Henry VIII. Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, throws the Catholics out of England. All of a sudden, anywhere from from a third to some estimates are as high as 40% of the best land in England is now no longer overseen by Catholics and their churches and their schools and their clinics and social welfare programs, housing for the homeless, etc. Now, this land has been vacated by the Catholics. Well, they've been thrown out, and Henry VIII sells this land, some of the best real estate in all of England, to his wealthy buddies to raise money for the British Navy principally. So what happens is as these wealthy guys begin to acquire these massive, beautiful pieces of real estate in England, it occurs to them that ever since 1492, all these Spaniards and Portuguese have been getting ridiculously wealthy with all of this gold and silver. And these British guys, they want their hands on that. And the British Navy is not yet strong enough to protect British ventures across the Atlantic. That's why Henry VIII is trying to raise money for the British Navy, right? So what they decide to do is they decide to replace the people who have been thrown off of all of these lands in England, replace them with sheep, because British wool apparently was and still is among the best wool in the world. And so the textile industry, right, turning wool that you shear off of the sheep into textiles, clothing, right? The textile industry is the first big international commodity that begins really the British Empire. So these British guys sell all of this wool and these textiles and the clothing to the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who want to show off their wealth, right? Their newfound wealth by wearing fancy clothes, right? And so this is essentially also the beginning of the fashion industry. So we refer to this as the enclosure movement because what literally happens is people begin to enclose their land. They begin to fence off their land. And so land that families worked on and lived off of, in some cases for centuries, is now suddenly privatized. What happens to all these people? They've got nowhere to go. They've got nothing to do, no way to make a living. So they huddle together and they go to these new things called textile factories, textile mills, right? Where they're turning wool into clothing. And they show up at these, early, rudimentary factories and say, I got nowhere to go. I got nowhere to live. I got no way to feed my family. What will you pay me to work in your textile mill? In other words, we have the beginning of a labor pool. And so, and in classic economic theory, we argue that this is the formulation, the forging of the first two critical agents or modes of production. Now I'm at the I guess it's the top of the second page. Our basic agents or factors of production are land, labor, and capital, right? With the enclosure movement, that was the commodification of land. All the people who are now homeless and jobless, that was the creation of a labor pool, right? And now they had to sell their human labor, basically sell their bodies in order to survive. So that now is the commodification of labor. And if you're lucky enough to have land, to be the owner of land or to be the owner of labor, then you begin to accumulate capital. And at some point, you accumulate more capital than you need for yourself, for your family, and more than you need even to maintain your land or your textile mill. You have excess capital, surplus capital. In other words, you have investable capital. What are you going to do with this capital? You're going to see if you can make some capital off of this capital. And so people started pooling their resources together and jointly investing in these transatlantic ventures to bring back riches from the Americas. In the case of the British, of course, what became the 13 American colonies. And now you have the commodification of capital. You see that? Land, labor, capital, the three core agents or modes of production. Some argue that the fourth is management. I disagree, but if you think there's four, they are land, labor, capital, and management. If you think there's three, they are definitely land, labor, and capital. So with the commodification of land, labor, and capital, now we have the beginning of a change in the economic system. Next defined term, economics. Economics, now I realize I'm not going exactly in the order of the testable term sheet. I'm going in the order of chronologically how these things evolved and developed in Europe, where capitalism was essentially born, right? But this is basically following the order of things in our existing testable term sheet. So next, economics. What is economics? Easy. It's simply the way that any given society chooses to allocate its resources. How do we allocate stuff in a particular society? In Plato's Republic or in Karl Marx's A Utopian Communist State, the way that we allocate things is you get this amount, I get the same amount, she gets the same amount, all those other guys get the same amount, right? Everybody has the same amount, not because we earn the same amount necessarily, but because we have decided, or the government has decided, that this is the type of society that we should live in. Plato and Karl Marx, for somewhat different reasons, argued essentially for a communist state. What's beginning to evolve in Europe with the commodification of land, labor, and capital is we're beginning to see the basis of a market system, especially after Pope Leo X agrees with his friend Jacob Fugger and decides to do away with the ancient prohibition on the lending of money with interest. Now financial institutions can openly lend money, charge interest, and by being able to circulate credit in the economy, more and more entrepreneurs are able to use this credit that didn't exist before to finance their ventures. Now you have the beginning of a market economy, right? Plato and Marx are examples of people who talked about a communist or socialist economy. Now what you see happening in Europe is the basis of a market economy. Of course, another key development in Europe that would have profound societal changes and also some implications for the crystallization of what we now understand to be modern capitalism is the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation was the breaking away of Christians who had been Catholics from the Catholic Church, and they start new Christian churches. They still believe in basically the God of the Jewish tradition. They still believe in Jesus Christ, but their practices and many of their beliefs are different than the Catholic Church. It all starts with a Catholic priest by the name of Martin Luther. Martin Luther breaks away from the Catholic Church in the year 1517, and the Protestant Reformation is on. Martin Luther is the first great Protestant. The next great significant Protestant is, of course, John Calvin. With Luther and Calvin, you see a very important shift in the way that Protestant Christians look at things like labor and work and private property and the accumulation of wealth. Because beginning with Luther and Calvin, we see a much greater openness to acquiring private property and acquiring work. Later, this brilliant sociologist, Max Weber, In 1905, Max Weber writes this work called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And basically, the thesis that Weber talks about, which not everybody agrees with, but it's a powerful thesis, and a lot of economists and sociologists and historians do agree with Weber on this particular perspective, and I included it in my class because I think he's really onto something. Uh, and the idea is that the Protestant ethic, a defined term, the Protestant ethic of working hard and not being afraid to acquire private property and grow your wealth, the Protestant ethic was instrumental to the rise of capitalism. Because with the Protestant ethic, you see a theological, but perhaps more importantly, a psychological shift in the mentality of a growing number of Europeans away from the old Catholic idea that private property is bad, to acquire private property is to be arrogant. That's not what we should be focused on here on earth, right? Uh, Toward a private property is good. It's not immoral. It's amoral. It might even be profoundly moral, right? And of course, Calvin introduces the notion of predestination, which suggests that, actually, if you think about it, the more private property you acquire, the more you prove that God gave you what it takes to succeed in this life, which is a pretty good hint that he loves you so much that you are among the few who is going to make it back to heaven. So the Protestant ethic is a powerful psychological willingness to pursue materialism. In the beginning, it's not a pursuit of materialism at the expense of your theological convictions. But the argument is that over time, right, the balance between what is morally correct and what is materially or materialistically desirable begins to change, right? And materialism becomes more and more important to people. And what the deity wants of us and what is morally correct becomes perhaps less important over time. And so the argument is that the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant ethic unintentionally leads to a greater emphasis in the Western psyche on Aristotelian materialism and away from Platonic and Christian commitment to doing what is necessary in this life to make it into the afterlife. Now, so in the 1500s, right, we can see the world is changing. First, materially, all this gold and silver is coming in. You've got the Catholic Church beginning to disintegrate. Lutheranism is on the rise. Calvinism is on the rise. There are other forms of Protestant movements that are going on. You begin to see conflicts between Catholic kingdoms and Protestant kingdoms, right? Warfare is beginning to take hold across Europe between Catholics and Protestants. And as all of this is going on, there's also amazing scientific discoveries, not the least of which is, of course, the discovery by guys like Copernicus, Kepler, and ultimately Galileo that the sun does not revolve around the earth the way the church and even Aristotle thought. Instead, the earth revolves around the sun. That was absolutely mind-blowing to everybody. And so with all of these developments, the old world and the old assumptions and old ways of thinking begin to die off. And people begin to realize, maybe there's a different way to live. I mean, everything's changing now, there's no one Christianity anymore. the sun doesn't revolve around us anymore, meaning we are no longer literally the center of God's universe. And now, hey, there's all this gold and silver flying around, or at least we got a handful of rich people who have all this gold and silver around. And what you mean? I can borrow money now? Well, I got to pay back more than I borrow, but now I can borrow money. The whole world is changing, so it's not surprising that increasingly people would begin to conclude that maybe living under a king, right, century after century after century, ain't such a great thing. And so you begin to see it's very private, and it's underground, it's covert because it's dangerous. You begin to see more and more people in Europe daring to dream about what it might be like to be free of this bullshit oligarchy, right? All of these kings. And after all, everyone gets to be the king simply because what? Because he's the smartest guy in the kingdom? No, because he's the asshole who happens to be the oldest surviving son of the idiot who was the king before him. So what I'm getting at is this notion of liberalism. I don't mean modern. Remember, this is not modern liberalism, as in Bernie Sanders, Gavin Newsom, that type of thing. This is historic, classic liberalism, earlier in modernity. It started in the 1500s. It really takes hold in the 1600s and thereafter. Liberalism is is a belief or a conviction, a commitment that we should be free from government oppression. We don't need a king anymore, right? The time has come to liberate ourselves of the old oppressive totalitarian governments, right? And so it's an imagination of a more open society where people can do what they want to do without the government breathing down their neck. And so, in a word, freedom. People are beginning to contemplate the possibility of being free. And so, uh, after a while, liberalism has takes another turn, because to see yourself as being politically free is one thing, but after a while, people start to think, well, you know what? I should be free to do what I want to do and live the way I want to live and make the kind of living that I want to make. If I want to sell shoes, that's what I want to do. If I want to be a banker someday, then that's what I should be able to do. And so the notion of economic liberalism takes hold, right? I should be free from government oppression. That's a liberal imagination. The economic permutation of that then is I should be economically free to practice whatever type of business I think I'm good at, and the government should have nothing to say about that. So economic liberalism, right? These essays and these papers that guys are starting to circulate, hey, what if we could live this way, right? Economic liberalism begins to become more and more openly discussed as being the right way to organize society, the right way to, if you will, practice an economy. So with the notion of economic freedom, economic liberalism, you can see also the philosophical, intellectual, and psychological foundation for the rise of capitalism. All of this is taking place among the wars that are going on between Protestants and Catholics, and in some cases between this type of Protestant and this type of Protestant. You see a hellacious civil war in England in the 1640s. After the end of the British Civil War, the king is actually executed, right? So this notion of liberalism becomes so strong that by 1649, I think it is, people in England are actually able to overthrow the king and cut his head off, right? And so to some people in England who were on that side of the Civil War, this was liberating. To other people in England who were supporting the king, this was devastating and this was scary. And one of the people who thought that this was scary, that the world was going in the wrong direction, was this guy named Thomas Hobbes. What's important about Thomas Hobbes is, of course, his classic book, Leviathan, in 1651. Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan is saying, wait a minute, guys. Now we're executing our own kings. This ain't the way to go. That this is a road to disaster. You guys need to understand. Look at the way we treated ourselves during the Civil War. We're homicidal maniacs. We're not ready to rule ourselves. We're not ready to govern ourselves. We need a strong king, okay? So Thomas Hobbes, because he's fearful that the people are not yet ready to govern themselves because they're all homicidal maniacs and they need a strong king to maintain order and security. Thomas Hobbes says, you know what? It's in our own best interest to have a king, to keep us safe, because without a king keeping us safe, we're going to kill each other. So we establish government, according to Hobbes. This is important. According to Hobbes, we establish government in order to protect us from each other. And according to Hobbes, if the king says we can have private property, then we can have private property. If the king says we can't, then we can't. Right? So that is Hobbes. 1651, Leviathan, we establish government to protect us from each other, and we don't have any private property unless the king says that we have private property. But it's Hobbes' notion that he introduces, his justification for an oligarchy, for living under a king, is different than the way it's been for over 1,000 years. His new justification is, we have a king not because God wants us to have this king. We have a king because it's in our own best interest to have a king, right? So other people would say, everything you said, Thomas, is bullshit except one thing. You're right, Thomas Hobbes, when you say that government should be justified on the basis of what we, the people, want. Enter Sir John Locke. John Locke, the most important work of his that concerns us is his second treatise on government, 1689, in which John Locke argues that actually the reason we establish government is to protect our private property. And for John Locke, private property is a natural right, and it's so important that any government that doesn't protect our private property is illegitimate, and we need to overthrow it. So John Locke on government, we establish government in order to protect our private property. John Locke on private property, not only is it okay to have private property, John Locke is now starting to go way beyond private property just being okay. John Locke is saying, no, it's not just okay. It is a natural right that we are born with, to have our own stuff. In fact, it's so important that it is our primary natural right. After John Locke, well, let me add one more thing about John Locke. Locke's proviso, which is also a testable term. Recall that in that paragraph where John Locke explains why private property is the most natural thing in the world, he ends that paragraph by saying, all of this is good and bitchin', as long as we leave enough and as good left in common for others. Now remember, he begins the paragraph by saying, all of creation we have inherited from the deity, right? All of the world was given to us to enjoy in common. And then several times in that paragraph, he uses the word common to talk about the common rights that we all have to the given world. And when we create private property, we then render that thing no longer common property, right? We render it private property. And we should freely do this as much as we want, as long as we leave enough and as good left in common for others to enjoy. That's Locke's proviso, meaning it's a provision, it's a constraint, it's a condition, right? Go ahead and practice materialism, private property, accumulate your wealth, but make sure that you leave enough and as good left in common for others, meaning not just others today, but future generations. Why is this important? Because similar to the notion of dominionism, Locke's proviso has important implications when we talk about climate change. Because, of course, the argument that I'm making is that if we had listened, right, if our predecessors had listened, not just to the first 80% of Locke's paragraph on private property, but the last part of it, then maybe we wouldn't be facing the climate crisis that we are today. After John Locke, a few decades later, now we are in the period of the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment is generally thought of as the 18th century, or that is to say the 1700s, right? And so in the Enlightenment era, we've got giants like Immanuel Kant toward the end of the Enlightenment era. We also have David Hume, and then we have David Hume's good friend, Adam Smith. And we also have a Swiss guy who was raised and educated in France, a gentleman by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rousseau. And Rousseau has two works that concern us. Remember, in 1757 was a Discourse on Inequality, and then 1762 was the book actually entitled The Social Contract. So Rousseau completes what Hobbes started and what Locke elaborated on, and that is this notion of the social contract. What is the social contract? That is also a defined term. Social contract is this imaginary, unwritten contract that supposedly everyone in civilization and society enters into. And when we enter into this contract, we are accepting certain rights and responsibilities, right? Rights that we can enjoy, but also responsibilities to other people, like to obey the law, right? But in a social contract, the government also assumes certain rights and responsibilities. The government gets its power from us. That starts with Hobbes, right? And then the government owes us certain obligations. According to Hobbes, it's to protect us from each other. According to Locke, the government is supposed to protect our stuff. And according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the government's end of the social contract bargain is that the government is supposed to do whatever we tell it to do. And so Rousseau says, no, we don't establish government to protect us from each other or to protect our stuff. We establish government primarily in order to advance the general will. What do we, the people, want? Therefore, Rousseau on private property, Rousseau says, if we want private property, then the government should allow it. If we change our mind and we want some restrictions on private property, then the government should impose the restrictions that we say. If the government doesn't do what we want, then the government has lost its legitimacy, and we have a solemn obligation to one another to take that government down. That's Rousseau, essentially. But the Age of Enlightenment, more specifically, think of the Age of Enlightenment. It's also referred to, and you may have heard of it more in this regard, as the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason. There's a profound conviction, confidence that by using our own reason, this is very Greek, right? By using our reason, we can figure things out, right? There are truths in the universe that we can understand. Our science is proving this to us, right? And so you have greater confidence in humanity's ability, right, to figure things out. An unintended consequence of this, perhaps, is that as the Western psyche's confidence in its own ability to understand the universe grows, our, our reliance in and our confidence in the theological vision of how to understand the universe through a Christian religious lens, right, begins to wane. Why do we need a God or any religious system? Why do we need a church to tell us what reality is, what the truth is, when science and our own reason is better able to tell us that? After all, the church for centuries said that this earth was the center of the universe, and the church was wrong. So the age of enlightenment, right? Immanuel Kant, who was one of the great, perhaps the great Enlightenment thinkers, who we're actually going to talk about next week. Immanuel Kant actually writes an essay toward the end of the century, in the 1780s, I believe, called "What is Enlightenment?" Right? So Immanuel Kant is actually explaining what enlightenment is, and in a phrase, according to Kant, enlightenment is the willingness to dare to know. We must have the courage, right, to pursue the truth, dare to know. That, according to Immanuel Kant, and I think all the other Enlightenment thinkers, even though they said it in different ways, that's basically the spirit of the age of enlightenment. Now, during this period, market economies are starting to take hold, but there's this other way of allocating resources, this other way of doing economics that is beginning to take hold, and it's a form of economics that's coming from the top. The kings in various kingdoms across Europe is telling the people, this is what we need to do. A market economy is where the people do what they want to do, and the market establishes pricing, right? And supply and demand dictates basically the way that the market plays itself out, right? So a market economy, Adam Smith would argue, comes from the bottom up. You and me and all of us making our economic choices. A different type of economy, a command economy where someone commands that it's going to be this way, is very different than a market economy. And that's what we're seeing in Europe during the 1700s. Because back then, the thinking was, at least among the kings, were this new wealth that's sweeping throughout Europe, at least among the wealthy elites. We've never known this. And we're not sure how to make our way through this, and we don't know who's winning. How do we know that we're winning, right? And so the King of England, right, would be like, well, how do I know that England is number one? How do we Spaniards know that we're still on top? And so the thinking was, well, whoever's got the most gold and silver must be the winner, right? You ever hear the term, whoever dies with the most toys is the winner? That's basically the thinking. So it's a very elementary, rudimentary, adolescent, even infantile way of thinking about things. This is not sophisticated economics, right? This is brute economics. Who's got the most, man, right? And so that's basically what mercantilism, our next defined term, that's basically what mercantilism is. So when you're convinced that what you need to do as a kingdom is grab as much gold and silver as you can and get more than the other guys, then what you want to do is you want to promote your exports as much as possible. You want other countries to buy your stuff, because when they buy your stuff, they're paying you in gold and silver, and that's what you want. What you don't want to do is you don't want to encourage imports coming into your country from other countries, because then when imports come into your country from other countries, you and your people have to pay for that stuff with gold and silver. And the idea isn't for gold and silver to leave your country. The idea is for gold and silver to come into your kingdom, and you want to hoard it, right? You want to hoard it, throw it in the king's castle, surround it with armed guards, and protect it. And whichever king has the most gold and silver in his vault, that's the winning kingdom. That is essentially mercantilism. Okay? So, mercantilism is an economic practice that works pretty well for kings and other elites. But by the time Adam Smith is doing his work as a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, part of the part of Great Britain, Adam Smith realizes that what's happening on the ground throughout Europe, what the people are doing, practicing economic liberalism, right, and doing their own thing, what the people are doing in many instances in underground economies, right, where they can't get busted, is they are beginning to practice market economics. I have these apples to sell. What are you willing to pay for my apples, right? You need some shoes, I can make you some shoes. If I made you these type of shoes, it would cost this. If I make you these other type of shoes, what would you give me for those, right? Market pricing, market transactions, people buying and selling goods and services without the government having any role whatsoever. Adam Smith looks across Europe. He realizes that this is the future, that this is a way to democratize wealth. This is the way for not just a few people to have wealth. This is a way for everybody to be able to have a piece of the action. Everybody, without government interference, is able to pursue their own entrepreneurial genius and make a living. And so Adam Smith says, we got to get government out of the way. Mercantilism, Adam Smith says, is a disaster. We got to stop this. So Adam Smith in 1776 publishes his classic Wealth of Nations, where he argues that a market economy is the way to go, and that this mercantilism thing that various kings, including King George in England, is insisting on is ultimately going to be a disaster for the entire kingdom, for all of Great Britain, and for any country that practices it. Adam Smith argues, you want to know what is the key to the wealth of nations? Let the people free. Let the people enjoy economic freedom. Let them choose the career that they want. That's essentially Adam Smith's position. Now, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, he uses this phrase called laissez-faire, and it's a defined term. Laissez-faire is, Adam Smith describes laissez-faire as a situation where the government has no role in economics. Now, a mistake that many people have made for a couple of hundred years is that Adam Smith was advocating for a complete laissez-faire system. I think that's quite wrong. And Wealth of Nations is divided into 5 books, as you can see in my videos under Adam Smith. I think there's 6 videos, they're each 15 minutes long. It's divided into 5 books. The last book, book 5 of the Wealth of Nations, the whole Wealth of Nations is about 900 pages. The last book, in the last book, Adam Smith talks about why laissez-faire is a possibility, but it's not the best way to go, because Adam Smith argues that, yes, government should be out of our way most of the time. But Adam Smith is also very clear, there are times when society, even the market, needs government to come in and provide some assistance. One example would be monopolies. Adam Smith hated the British East India Company. He hated it. He felt that it was a monopoly that had too much power. It had too much economic power and too much political power. And that the British East India Company was using its economic power to exercise political power with King George. Exactly what Plato predicted, right? And Adam Smith said that's wrong. Because what the British East India Company doing as a monopoly is it's convincing the king that the king should allow nobody to compete with the British East India Company. That's why they're a monopoly. They have no competition. And Adam Smith says that's not good. That may be good for the British East India Company for a while, but ultimately everyone's going to hurt, even the British East India Company. Why? Because a market economy needs competition. A market economy uh, requires people to have choices. In a market economy, we must be free, and we must be free to make choices, but that means there needs to be a choice. So if one guy, right, has a monopoly on toilet paper in the midst of a coronavirus, well, you know who the next richest guy in the world is going to be. It's going to be the owner of the only toilet paper company in the whole freaking world, right? He's got the monopoly, right? And so, what do you think the price is going to be for toilet paper? That's right. It's going to go. It's going to go through the roof, right? We're all going to be using newspapers and banana leaves after a while. That's when civilization collapses, man. When we all start using newspapers and banana leaves, you know what I'm talking about, right? We all get neighborhood and shit. And Adam Smith's like, no, we need competition. People need and deserve a choice. If they don't like the price of toilet paper over here, right? And someone else is selling the same quality toilet paper, but at a cheaper price, then people should have the economic freedom to go to guy number two and say, I want to buy toilet paper from you, right? And then what happens to toilet paper guy number one? Either he's going to go out of business or he's going to have to drop his prices. So Adam Smith brilliantly points out, the more competition there is, the more that at least over time, prices will come down. And that's good for everybody. Makers of toilet paper may not think it's good for them, but when people are able to afford goods and services in their economy, right, then the more that you and I buy things from people, the more that the people who sell those things are able to make money. The more that they're able to make money, the more that they are able to hire more employees. The more employees that they are able to hire, the greater chance you and I have of, of getting a job at that place after we graduate, or leaving the job that we have because that place now has, because their revenues are so high, they now have the ability to hire more people, and maybe that's a better place to work. That is a mature market economy. Adam Smith says that is the future. So Adam Smith says, yeah, we could do laissez-faire. That's an extreme version of a market economy. But Adam Smith says, what I'm saying is we should stop short of that. Government has a proper role sometimes. So Adam Smith is also smart enough to point out what really drives an economy. And as I just intimated, it's not production. It's not the guys who make the stuff. It's consumers, right? So what really drives an economy, according to Adam Smith, and many, but not all, modern economists, to be sure. But the Smithian perspective is, which for what it's worth, I think makes tremendous sense, is consumers drive an economy. Because Adam Smith points out in The Wealth of Nations, hey, you could be a tremendous manufacturer, right? But if no one wants to buy your stuff, all your stuff is just going to sit there on the shelves. And after a while, you're going to have to go under. What good is a massive kick-ass inventory if you've got no buyers? So Adam Smith points out, no, it's the consumers who drive an economy, right? Production obviously is terribly important, but if there's no demand, why the hell supply the supply if there's no demand, right? So that's the distinction between consumption and production. So Adam Smith is the first classical economist, right? He doesn't invent capitalism, but what Adam Smith is brilliant at is in looking at people's behavior and understanding what's really going on, and being able to describe it on the one hand in a very complex, organized, logical fashion, but also in a way that people can understand. And it's that combination of brilliance, but the ability to speak plainly and clearly uh, that made Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations so compelling and revolutionary to this day. There's before I leave Adam Smith completely, as you can see from my Adam Smith videos, there's one other absolute masterpiece of his, and that has a lot more to do with ethics, morality, and philosophy, which I argue was always Adam Smith's principal concern, and that is, of course, his 1759 book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. So let us not forget that Adam Smith offers us two great works. A Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1759, in which he argues that we must be morally and ethically principled. He talks about the four virtues that we are born with and that we should cultivate in order to be moral people. And they're basically Plato's, strangely enough. Wisdom, benevolence or kindness, self-control, and then finally justice. And so what Adam Smith is arguing is that as individuals, if we can practice these four virtues, then we will be just individuals. And as a society, if enough of us in a society practice these four virtues, then the society as a whole may become a just society where justice is important, justice is valued, and justice is at least to some acceptable a degree achieved. That's the type of society, the morally principled society. That's the type of society that can, with confidence, give rise to the capitalist citadel that Adam Smith writes about 17 years later in Wealth of Nations. So my argument is that Adam Smith invites us to enjoy the fruits of capitalism in the Wealth of Nations, but he's asking us first to make sure that we as individuals and that we collectively as a society are morally grounded. Why? Because I think Adam Smith, who we know read Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality, because I believe that Adam Smith was profoundly concerned, as Plato was, about the dangers of becoming overly materialistic. And that is why Adam Smith's third virtue is self-command. We must exercise self-control when we are in the marketplace, and we must be ethical economic actors. Whether we're a buyer or a seller, we must be a buyer or seller with ethical principles. The classic economist, you can see the definition here. What happens with classical economics beginning in the 1800s is you see more and more classical economists begin to make the argument that Adam Smith was much more of a laissez-faire advocate and proponent than Adam Smith actually was. So you begin to see in the 1800s with guys like Malthus, Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. We're going to talk about John Stuart Mill next week in the context of his ethical system. You see much more emphasis on mathematics and mathematical equations, and economics with classical economists in the 1800s. Economics becomes much more math-based and much less concerned with moral and ethical principles, the likes of which Adam Smith wrote about in the Wealth of Nations. In the 1800s, what we see increasing concern that while this new market economy, this thing which after Adam Smith dies in 1790, Adam Smith didn't use the word capitalism. He uses the word capital, right, like a couple of hundred times in the Wealth of Nations, but he doesn't use the word capitalism. Capitalism, as a term, is basically created by the classic economic theorists of the 1800s after Adam Smith dies. But so as capitalism, as people are now calling it, the market economy, as capitalism is spreading across Europe, and more people are experiencing wealth, there's also a downside to it. We begin to see more and more economic inequality. We begin to see more and more poverty. And so we begin to see intellectuals in Europe who begin to be very critical about capitalism and are afraid, or at least concerned about capitalism. And two that we look at, that I'll talk about more tomorrow, Thursday, during our lecture, which by the way is going to be live, but it's also going to be taped. So if you can't do the live one, don't worry about it. Later in the day, you'll be able to see it. One is Karl Marx, and the other is Thorstein Veblen. And I guess I'll mention one more, who is Friedrich Nietzsche. Three guys in the 1800s, very quickly. Karl Marx, he's a communist. He thinks that capitalism is bad. Karl Marx, if you look at my capitalism and modernity chart, I have a line from Adam Smith to Karl Marx. Why? Because Karl Marx understands economics because he actually read Adam Smith. Well, to read Karl Marx is to understand that this guy really understands wealth of nations. He just has a totally different conclusion than Adam Smith. Karl Marx looks at the same market economy system that Adam Smith does. And Adam Smith says, you know, if we have enough self-control that I wrote about in my theory of moral sentiments, we should be okay. Karl Marx says, that's bullshit. We don't have enough self-control. Certainly the people who have power and wealth don't have that kind of self-control, because they're going to keep the rest of us down. They want to grab as much power and wealth for themselves and keep the rest of us down. And Karl Marx says, you know what? This is nothing new. Capitalism is new, but the oppression of the many by the few is as old as our species is. And so Karl Marx says, throughout time, history shows us that there has always been a class struggle. Class struggle is a big thing to Marx. Class struggle, where, and this is Plato too, there has always been a few wealthy, powerful guys who purposefully contrive to perpetuate a system where they maintain the power, they maintain the wealth, and the rest of us get screwed. And it ain't by accident, it's on purpose. And Marx says it's always been this way. The difference is that now capitalism has people believing that this is the best thing for them to do. And Karl Marx says it's kind of like Plato's allegory of the cave. We're staring at a wall, we're looking at the shadows, right? We think we're having a great time, right? But someone else has contrived this, right? This ain't reality, this ain't the way that we should be living, right? Just like Rousseau said, we should be asking ourselves, why is there so much poverty, and why can't more of us experience wealth like those guys? And so Karl Marx in 1848, and we need to know this for the test, he writes his brilliant and obviously wildly controversial Communist Manifesto, where he says that class struggle sucks, always has, always will, until we rise up, workers of the world unite, until we rise up, right? We realize that we're getting the shaft, and we take these guys out. Revolution, right? So he builds on Adam Smith, but he also builds on Rousseau. Revolution. That is in a nutshell, that's Karl Marx. A few decades later, an American guy by the name of Thorstein Veblen would come along. And he's not a Marxist, right? Although people think that he is, because Veblen is critical of some parts of capitalism in this way. Veblen writes in 1898 this book called Theory of the Leisure Class. Theory of the Leisure Class. And in this book, he makes the following argument. Karl Marx's mistake, Veblen argues, was in thinking that the masses of people would look at the elites and want to take them down. And Veblen argues Karl Marx doesn't understand human nature, because it's quite obvious that the masses look at the elites and they don't want to take them down. They want to pretend to be like them. And Veblen says, you don't see people trying to start a revolution. What you see is Americans through their buying habits, buying things, right, like clothing and jewelry, right, in order to look like the guys that they are now beginning to worship. It's the beginning, Veblen says, of celebrity culture, where we are beginning to worship the rich and famous, not because of the content of their character or their Adam Smithian virtues, but because they have money, because they look good, because they have kick-ass clothes, because they have big-ass houses, right? And so what Veblen is arguing is that, you know what the rich are doing? They are flaunting their wealth by buying things and then showing it off. It's conspicuous consumption. We're consuming things and then we're showing it off conspicuously. To be conspicuous is to be open and obvious. Look at me, look at me. I'm on my Instagram. Look at me. And Veblen says, hey, it's human nature, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous, Veblen argues, right? That there's a psychological downside to this obsession with materialism. And so Veblen comes up with the term conspicuous consumption. What Americans are beginning to do, rich and not so rich, is to buy things that we don't need uh, and we really can't afford, and we're not buying them because they have any real inherent value. We're buying them because we think that in the eyes of other people, it makes us look good. That's Thorstein Veblen, 1898, theory of the leisure class, and his notion of conspicuous consumption. At around the same time in Germany, there's another social critic, like Rousseau, like Marx, but in a way perhaps much more devastating. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is most famous, rightly or wrongly, he's most famous for saying God is dead. Nietzsche's not the first person who said God is dead. There have been atheists for forever. Nietzsche's point is that Europe, and by extension all of Western civilization, has built up an entire morality system that is based on a God that Nietzsche says never existed. And as Europe, according to Nietzsche, as Western civilization becomes more and more agnostic, more and more worried that maybe God never really did exist, and for some of us in the West, outright atheist, right? It's beginning to dawn on us that the lawgiver maybe never existed, but we're still operating under the same basic moral laws, right? Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do this, right? And Nietzsche is saying that's dangerous because psychologically we're pretending to adhere to a morality system that whose origin is a God that we no longer believe in. And here's Nietzsche's real point when he says God is dead and we have killed him. Nietzsche's real point is, hey man, you guys have built a morality system on the basis of an absentee landlord who was never there. And my point, Nietzsche says, is you guys, Western civilization, you've got nothing to replace it with. You don't have a morality system that is non-deity based ultimately, and in the absence of a grounding for your morality system, Western civilization is beginning to drift. Right, the Western psyche has lost its mooring, its anchors. We're a ship adrift in a mighty storm, and we don't know where we're going because we really don't understand where we've been. That is Friedrich Nietzsche's point, and for amazing reasons that defy my understanding. I appreciate Nietzsche's brilliance, but it's amazing to me that Nietzsche still remains so popular with people on the political left, but also people on the political right. Nietzsche, some argue, lays the philosophical foundation for the entire next next century. But for our purposes, Nietzsche is important because Next week, we'll be talking about ethical systems, and we'll move on to some other subjects. But Nietzsche is important because Nietzsche asks us to look at the basis for all of our ethical systems. And what Nietzsche is saying is our morality system isn't working, and we haven't come up with a new one. And in our inability to come up with a new morality system, we are devastatingly lost. At least that is Nietzsche's position. So since I need to go to my next review session, those are the testable terms that you can count on being on the multiple choice. What I will do is, if you have specific questions, please email me the questions, and I will do this. I will accumulate the questions, and at the end of today, I will send out an announcement to everybody in the class with the question and my answer. Fair enough? Thank you, guys. I'm afraid I got to run. I appreciate your time.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.